Before the crowds gathered, before the miracles were spoken of, she prayed all night. What happens when a broken, grieving woman dares to linger in God's presence while the world sleeps? What kind of power is born in silence, surrender, and unseen tears? This is not just a story about revival. It is a story about the secret place, the hidden hours, where faith is forged, strength is stripped away, and real authority is born. In an age that celebrates platforms, applause, and visibility, the life of Maria Woodworth-Etter confronts us with a deeper question. What if true power comes from obscurity, not recognition? Stay with us as we uncover how relentless prayer ignited revival, why intimacy with God attracted both miracles and persecution, and what her life still demands from believers today. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone hungry for deeper faith. Now let's step into the secret place. In every generation, there are voices that rise against the current of their time, voices that sound strange, unsettling, even dangerous to the systems they confront. In the late 19th century, when pulpits were guarded almost exclusively by men and spiritual authority was tightly regulated by tradition, one such voice emerged from obscurity. Her name was Maria Woodworth-Etter, and her life would become a living contradiction to everything society believed about power, prayer, and who God was allowed to use. Maria was not born into influence. She was not trained in elite seminaries or groomed for public ministry. Her beginnings were painfully ordinary, marked by poverty, grief, and relentless hardship. Born in 1844 in rural Ohio, Maria grew up in a world where survival itself was a daily battle. Education was limited, opportunities were scarce, and for women, expectations were suffocatingly narrow. A woman's role was simple: endure, obey, and remain unseen. But Maria's life would not follow that script. From a young age, suffering became her closest companion. She experienced repeated lost children dying in infancy, crushing financial instability, and emotional isolation that hollowed her from the inside. These tragedies did not merely wound her. They pushed her toward a breaking point where shallow religion could no longer sustain her. She did not need polite sermons or borrowed faith. She needed an encounter, and that hunger would lead her somewhere few dared to go. While many around her practiced a Christianity of routine Sunday services, memorized prayers, inherited doctrines, Maria began to withdraw into long hours of prayer. Not the kind of prayer meant to impress others, but the kind born out of desperation. Prayer that stripped language down to groans. Prayer that lingered through the night when exhaustion begged her to stop. Prayer that felt less like devotion and more like survival. She prayed not because it was fashionable, but because it was necessary. As Maria pressed deeper into this hidden life of prayer, something began to change. Not outwardly at first. There were no platforms, no crowds, no recognition. But inwardly, a fire was being kindled. She later described these seasons as encounters with what she called the secret place, a realm of communion with God that could not be accessed through noise, ambition, or performance. It was discovered only through surrender. This secret place would become the axis upon which her entire ministry turned. When Maria eventually began to speak publicly about her experiences, resistance came swiftly. Clergy condemned her, churches closed their doors. Critics labeled her delusional, emotionally unstable, even demonized. After all, who was she to teach? Who was she to preach? Who was she, an uneducated woman, to claim divine authority? But Maria had already learned something her critics had not. Power is not granted by permission. It is revealed through intimacy. As she continued praying, sometimes all night, sometimes 4 days, unusual manifestations began to occur during her meetings. People wept uncontrollably. Hardened skeptics fell to their knees. Entire congregations were overtaken by a sense of divine presence, so heavy that words failed. Some collapsed under conviction. Others testified of healing, deliverance, and deep inner transformation. To observers, it looked chaotic. To critics, It looked dangerous. But to those who were hungry, it looked like God. Maria did not orchestrate these moments. She did not manipulate emotions or engineer outcomes. In fact, she often seemed overwhelmed by what was happening herself. She insisted that what people were encountering was not her power, but God responding to a people willing to linger in His presence. Still, the backlash intensified. Newspapers mocked her. Religious leaders accused her of fanaticism. Some warned that her meetings were undermining order and reason. Yet everywhere she went, crowds gathered not because she promised spectacle, but because something real was happening. In a religious landscape saturated with formality, Maria carried something raw and undeniable. She carried the weight of prayer. What made her especially threatening was not merely that she was a woman preaching, but that she was pointing people away from institutions and toward intimacy. She was teaching that God could be known personally, powerfully, without mediation, that the same spirits who filled apostles could fill farmers, widows, laborers, and the poor. This message was revolutionary. Maria's authority did not come from charisma alone. It came from a life shaped in obscurity. Long before crowds gathered, she had learned to kneel alone. Long before miracles followed her ministry, she had learned to weep in the presence of God. The secret place was not a metaphor for her, it was a lived reality, and it demanded a cost. As her ministry expanded, so did the strain on her body and mind. Endless travel, constant criticism, and the emotional weight of revival wore her down, yet she refused to retreat. She believed that what God was doing was bigger than her comfort, bigger than her reputation, bigger even than her safety. Because once you have tasted the secret place, silence becomes impossible. By the end of this early phase of her life, Maria Woodworth-Etter had already crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer merely a grieving mother or a praying woman hidden in rural America. She was becoming a vessel through which an entire movement would be stirred. But this was only the beginning. The real question still loomed: what exactly was the secret place she claimed to have discovered? And why did it seem to release such extraordinary power wherever she went? To understand that, we must follow Maria deeper past the public controversy and into the unseen hours where her strength was forged. Because the secret place was not just where her ministry began, it was where everything else was stripped away. When the crowds finally dispersed and the echoes of revival meetings faded into silence, Maria Woodworth-Etter returned to the same place where her strength had always been forged, not the pulpit, not the platform, but the lonely hours of the night. While others slept, she prayed. While critics wrote their accusations, she knelt. And while the world tried to explain away what was happening around her, Maria pressed deeper into the unseen realm she had come to know as the secret place. These night watches were not poetic metaphors. They were literal, exhausting, and costly. Maria often spent entire nights awake, pacing, kneeling, or lying face down before God. Candlelight flickered against wooden walls as she cried out in whispers, so as not to wake the household. Her prayers were not polished. They were raw, repetitive, and sometimes wordless. She prayed until her body trembled, until tears ran dry, until silence itself became sacred. This was where power was cultivated. Maria believed something that would shape the rest of her life: that intimacy with God required time and uninterrupted, inconvenient, sacrificial time. She rejected the idea that spiritual authority could be rushed or borrowed. In her journals and later testimonies, she spoke of prayer as a place of wrestling, where human will was slowly surrendered and divine will took its place. It was in these prolonged hours that she experienced what she described as overwhelming visitations of God's presence. Sometimes she felt consumed by joy so intense it left her weak. Other times she was crushed by conviction, compelled to repent not just of obvious sins, but of subtle attachments, fear, pride, self-preservation. The secret place exposed everything, and Maria let it. She learned that power did not come from asking God to bless her plans, but from abandoning them entirely. Many nights ended with her whispering a simple prayer: "Not my will, only yours." That surrender became the gateway through which authority flowed. Yet these encounters were not always comforting. Some nights were marked by spiritual anguish. Maria spoke of feeling pressed by unseen resistance, moments when prayer felt like pushing against a closed heaven. These were the hours when many would give up, assuming God was distant or displeased. But Maria learned to stay. She stayed when prayer felt dry. She stayed when exhaustion screamed for rest. She stayed when nothing seemed to be happening. And it was precisely in that perseverance that something shifted. Slowly, she noticed a pattern. The deeper the night prayer, the greater the breakthrough that followed. Meetings after intense seasons of intercession carried unusual weight, words spoken from the pulpit cut deeper. Conviction fell faster. Healings occurred without effort. It was as though the battles had already been fought in secret before they ever manifested in public. Maria began to understand the spiritual law. What is won in private is released in public. This revelation reshaped her entire approach to ministry. She refused to schedule meetings without first saturating them in prayer. If she felt prayer was incomplete, she postponed gatherings even when crowds had already assembled. To her, stepping into public ministry without sufficient time in the secret place was not just unwise. It was dangerous. This discipline baffled organizers and frustrated supporters. They wanted consistency, predictability, efficiency. Maria wanted obedience. Her nights of prayer also sharpened her spiritual discernment. She became increasingly sensitive to atmospheres able to sense fear, resistance, or hunger in a room before a word was spoken. This awareness did not come from training, but from familiarity with God's presence. When you spend enough time in silence with Him, noise becomes obvious. But this depth came at a cost. Physically, Maria's body began to bear the strain. Sleepless nights weakened her health. Emotional fatigue followed her like a shadow. Loneliness deepened as even fellow believers struggled to understand her intensity. Many admired the fruit of her ministry, but recoiled from the process that produced it. Maria felt that isolation keenly. There were nights when she questioned whether the price was too high. Nights when grief resurfaced, memories of lost children, broken relationships, and years of hardship flooding her mind. Yet instead of running from that pain, she carried it into prayer. The secret place became not only a site of power, but of healing. In God's presence, she was not required to be strong. She was allowed to be honest, and that honesty forged authority. Unlike religious leaders who hid behind titles and composure, Maria ministered from a place of transparency. People sensed it. They trusted her not because she appeared flawless, but because she had clearly been with God. Her words carried weight because they had first broken her. This is why her ministry could not be manufactured or replicated easily. Others tried to imitate the manifestations, people falling, trembling, weeping, but without the hidden hours of prayer, the results rang hollow. Maria herself warned against chasing experiences without embracing the discipline of the secret place. She insisted that prayer was not a tool to access power, but a relationship that reshaped the one who prayed. Over time, these all-night vigils began to define her identity. She was no longer merely an evangelist. She was a watchman, one who stood in the gap while others rested, one who believed that spiritual movements were sustained not by talent, but by intercession, and history would prove her right. As revival fires spread across regions she visited, Maria knew the source was not her voice or her presence. It was the unseen altar built night after night in solitude, an altar soaked with tears, surrender, and relentless pursuit of God. Yet the deeper she went into the secret place, the more intense the opposition became. Critics were no longer content with mockery, they sought to shut her down entirely. Accusations escalated, pressure mounted, and soon, Maria would be forced to confront a sobering truth. Intimacy with God does not shield one from suffering, it often invites it. When the hidden fire of the secret place finally erupted into public view, Maria Woodworth-Etter discovered a sobering truth. The same power that draws the hungry will also provoke the threatened. What had been birthed in silence now confronted the noise of the world, and the collision was unavoidable. Her meetings began to change dramatically. What once looked like ordinary preaching services became charged environments where something unseen pressed in on everyone present. Before Maria finished her sermons, people began to cry out under conviction. Some fell to the ground, overwhelmed by what they described as the presence of God. Others shook, wept, or lay motionless for hours, unable to explain what was happening to them. Hardened skeptics, men who had come only to mock, left trembling and repentant. News traveled fast. Crowds swelled into the thousands. Entire towns shut down businesses when Maria arrived. Farmers left their fields. Mothers brought sick children. Skeptics came armed with arguments. Reporters came looking for a scandal. No matter the motive, people came because something undeniable was happening. And with visibility came resistance. Religious leaders who had tolerated her in obscurity now felt threatened. Maria was not merely preaching. She was bypassing their control. She did not require formal church membership, denominational approval, or theological credentials. People encountered God directly in her meetings, and that terrified systems built on mediation. Accusations followed swiftly. She was called a fanatic, a deceiver, an emotional manipulator, a danger to public order. Newspapers caricatured her services as hysteria. Pastors warned their congregations to stay away. Some claimed her work was demonic. Others insisted it was psychological suggestion, mass delusion, or worse, intentional fraud. Maria listened, but she did not retreat. What made the criticism especially painful was that it often came from fellow Christians. Men who preached from pulpits questioned her sanity. Leaders who spoke of love sought to silence her. The irony was bitter. Those who claimed to defend God were often the most uncomfortable with His presence. Yet Maria did not pretend the opposition did not affect her. Public pressure weighed heavily on her soul. She was examined, interrogated, and in some cases legally threatened. Authorities worried that her meetings disrupted social order. Doctors were brought in to observe participants, hoping to explain away the phenomena as nervous disorders. Maria endured it all with a quiet resolve that only deep prayer could produce. She understood something critical. Revival always exposes fault lines. It reveals what people truly trust: control or surrender, reputation or obedience, safety or truth. The fire that purified some inevitably threatened others, but the greatest battle was not external. As power increased, so did temptation. Maria faced subtle dangers: pride, isolation, exhaustion, and the temptation to identify herself with the manifestations rather than the source. The attention was overwhelming. People spoke her name with reverence. Some treated her as indispensable, even infallible. She resisted fiercely. Maria repeatedly reminded audiences that she was not the healer, not the power, not the center. She warned against focusing on phenomena instead of transformation. Falling, trembling, and weeping meant nothing, she said, if lives were not changed afterward. This insistence kept her grounded. Still, the strain was relentless. Physically, she was often ill. Emotionally, she carried the weight of thousands of stories, miracles, tragedies, confessions, disappointments. Spiritually, she felt the constant tension of standing between heaven and earth, interceding for people who might never understand the cost. There were moments when she considered stopping. During one especially intense season of opposition, Maria withdrew again into extended prayer. She questioned whether the backlash was a sign she had gone too far. In the silence, she did not receive comfort, she received clarity. The answer was simple and terrifying: go on. Not because it would be easier, not because she would be understood, but because obedience was more important than approval. That decision marked a turning point. Maria stopped trying to defend herself. She let critics speak. She let newspapers print their stories. She returned to the pattern that had sustained her from the beginning: prayer, surrender, obedience. If God was truly at work, she believed, He would vindicate His own presence, and in time, He did. Testimonies multiplied, lives permanently changed, addictions broken, families restored, faith rekindled. Even some former critics quietly acknowledged that something beyond human explanation was at work. While opposition never fully disappeared, it lost its power to stop what had already been set in motion. Maria's ministry began to influence what would later become known as the Pentecostal and charismatic movements. Though she did not use those labels herself, her emphasis on direct encounter, spiritual manifestations, and deep prayer laid groundwork others would later build upon. Yet she paid a price few saw. The deeper she went into God's power, the more she accepted a life of misunderstanding. She would never be fully embraced by religious institutions. She would always exist on the margins, too spiritual for the comfortable, too disruptive for the established. But Maria had already made peace with that. She knew the secret place did not produce popularity, it produced faithfulness. And faithfulness, once forged, could withstand storms that talent and charisma never could. As revival fires continued to burn, Maria carried within her a sobering awareness: power without intimacy becomes corruption, and intimacy without obedience becomes stagnation. She had chosen the narrow path between the two. And yet, even as her influence spread, another chapter loomed, one that would test her theology, her endurance, and her understanding of suffering more deeply than ever before. Because the greatest revelations of the secret place were still ahead, and they would come not through triumph, but through brokenness. By the time Maria Woodworth-Etter reached the later years of her ministry, she understood something many never learn: the secret place does not only reveal power, it exposes weakness. And more often than not, God chooses to work through that weakness rather than remove it. The public still saw revival. They saw crowds, testimonies, and undeniable spiritual impact. What they did not see was the private unraveling that accompanied it. Years of relentless travel, spiritual warfare, emotional labor, and sleepless nights had taken their toll. Maria's body was frail. Her nerves were often strained. Periods of deep exhaustion left her physically incapacitated, sometimes unable to minister at all. To some observers, this seemed like a contradiction. How could a woman used so powerfully by God be so broken in body and spirit? Shouldn't divine favor translate into strength, ease, and longevity? Maria's life answered that question with quiet severity. She learned through pain that God's definition of power was not the same as humanity's. The secret place she loved so deeply was not designed to elevate her above suffering, but to anchor her within it. Prayer did not exempt her from grief, it gave her language to carry it. Intimacy did not shield her from weakness, it revealed how deeply she depended on grace. In these seasons, her prayers changed. They were no longer dominated by cries for revival or intercession for others. Increasingly, they became prayers of surrender. Not surrender as resignation, but surrender as trust. Trust that God was still good when healing did not come quickly. Trust that obedience still mattered when strength was gone. Trust that fruitfulness could exist even when visibility diminished. Maria wrestled deeply with this reality. She had seen countless people healed, some instantly, some dramatically. And yet her own ailments lingered. The irony was painful. At times, she questioned whether she had misunderstood God's promises. But each time she withdrew into the secret place, the answer was not explanation, it was presence, and presence was enough. She began to understand that her earlier seasons of power had prepared her for this quieter, more hidden obedience. The same God who met her in nights of fiery intercession met her in stillness, weakness, and restraint. The secret place had changed shape, but not substance. In this crucible, Maria's theology matured. She stopped equating God's favor with visible success. She stopped measuring effectiveness by crowds or manifestations. Instead, she began to see faithfulness as the truest measure of power. To keep praying when strength fails, to keep trusting when outcomes are unclear, to keep obeying when applause is absent. This was a deeper revelation than revival. Her preaching reflected this shift. While the supernatural still accompanied her ministry, her words carried a new gravity. She spoke openly about suffering, endurance, and the cost of obedience. She warned young ministers not to idolize power without understanding sacrifice. She urged believers to seek God Himself, not experiences, not results, not recognition. Some listeners struggled with this message. They preferred the fire without the ashes, the glory without the cross. But Maria had walked too far with God to offer illusions. She knew now that the secret place always leads to cruciform living life shaped by surrender, humility, and endurance. In her loneliest moments, Maria returned again and again to prayer, not to change her circumstances, but to remain anchored in truth. The secret place became less about seeking breakthroughs and more about maintaining communion. It was where she laid down questions she could not answer and found peace without resolution. And in that peace, something remarkable happened. Though her physical strength declined, her spiritual authority deepened. People sensed it. Those who came to her in later years often described her presence as weighty, quiet, and profoundly grounding. She no longer needed dramatic manifestations to demonstrate power. Her life itself testified. Broken, yet faithful, weakened, yet obedient, hidden, yet deeply fruitful. Maria Woodworth-Etter had discovered that the ultimate test of the secret place was not what it could produce, but who it could shape her into becoming. The woman who once prayed all night for power now prayed for perseverance. And God honored that prayer. She never abandoned her calling. She never renounced the fire, but she allowed her understanding of power to be refined by suffering. That refinement preserved her from disillusionment and protected the integrity of her witness. By the time her life began to draw toward its final chapter, Maria had become something rare, a living testimony that intimacy with God is not a phase, not a method, and not a means to an end. It is a lifelong posture, one that sustains both revival and silence, strength and weakness, beginnings and endings. And as she looked back, she could see the thread that held everything together. The secret place had never been about escape. It had always been about transformation. As the life of Maria Woodworth-Etter quietly moved toward its conclusion, there were no grand ceremonies to mark her passing from public view. No monuments erected in her honor, no institutional empire bearing her name, and yet, long after her voice faded from revival tents and prayer halls, the echoes of her life continued to shape generations she would never meet. That, perhaps, is the clearest evidence of her true legacy. Maria did not leave behind a movement defined by methods. She did not codify formulas for revival or publish blueprints for power. What she left behind was far more demanding and far more enduring. She left behind a witness to the secret place, a testimony that intimacy with God is not a spiritual luxury, but the engine of authentic power. In a world increasingly obsessed with visibility, Maria's life stands as a quiet rebuke. She proved that the most consequential work of God often happens when no one is watching. Before crowds gathered, she prayed alone. Before power was displayed publicly, surrender was practiced privately. Before authority was recognized by others, it was forged through obedience in obscurity. This is why her influence outlived her era. Though she lived before the modern Pentecostal movement took formal shape, her ministry anticipated it in spirit and substance. Emphasis on direct encounter with God, expectation of the Spirit's active presence, and the belief that ordinary people could walk in extraordinary faith, all of these found early expression in her life. Later generations would give names and structures to what Maria had simply lived. But her greatest contribution was not theological, it was relational. She showed that prayer is not preparation for ministry. Prayer is ministry. The hours she spent kneeling in silence were not delays to effectiveness. They were the very source of it. In a culture that prizes speed, efficiency, and measurable results, Maria's life insists on a slower, deeper path. The path of lingering. Her story also challenges modern assumptions about power. Today, power is often associated with platforms, influence, and reach. Maria's power came from alignment. She was powerful because she was yielded, authoritative because she was obedient, effective because she was faithful long before she was celebrated. Even her suffering speaks to us now. Maria never presented intimacy with God as a guarantee of ease. Her life dismantles the illusion that closeness to God exempts one from pain. Instead, it reveals a more demanding truth. Intimacy deepens our capacity to endure suffering without losing faith. The secret place did not remove Maria's weakness. It redeemed it. That message is desperately needed. Many today abandon faith when expectations of comfort collide with reality. Maria's life offers another framework, one in which weakness becomes a meeting point with grace, and unanswered questions become invitations to trust. She teaches us that perseverance is itself a form of power. Her endurance was not loud, but it was steadfast. As she aged, Maria receded further from public prominence. New voices emerged, new leaders rose, revival movements evolved. And yet, she did not grasp for relevance or attempt to reclaim attention. She remained content to dwell where she always had in communion with God. That quiet faithfulness may be her most radical act of all. Because it tells us something essential, the secret place is not a season we graduate from. It is not a ladder we climb and then discard. It is the foundation upon which everything else rests when the crowds disappear, when strength fades, when influence wanes. The secret place remains. Maria Woodworth-Etter's life answers a question many are afraid to ask. What if power is not about what we can do for God, but about who we are becoming with Him? She became someone marked by surrender, by obedience, by endurance, by intimacy that outlasted acclaim. Her legacy invites us to reconsider our own spiritual pursuits. Are we chasing outcomes or presence? Are we seeking visibility or transformation? Are we willing to stay in prayer when nothing dramatic happens, when no one applauds, when no results are immediately visible? Because that is where power is truly shaped. The secret place is still available. It has not diminished with time or culture. It does not require talent, platform, or permission. It asks only for hunger, honesty, and willingness to stay. Maria's life assures us that those who linger there will never be the same. Not all will preach 2000s. Not all will be remembered by history. But all who enter the secret place will be changed. And that, ultimately, is the power Maria Woodworth-Etter discovered when she prayed all night, not a power to impress the world, but a power to remain faithful until the end. A power that still waits for those willing to kneel. As we step away from the life of Maria Woodworth-Etter, one truth remains unmistakable. Power was never the goal, intimacy was. Her story reminds us that the deepest works of God are born far from applause, in hidden hours of surrender, where faith is tested and obedience is refined. She prayed when no one was watching, endured when strength failed, and remained faithful when recognition faded. And in doing so, she discovered a power that outlived her generation. The secret place is not reserved for revivalists of the past. It is still open to anyone willing to linger, listen, and yield. Maria's life asks us a final question. What might God do if we valued His presence more than our comforts? If this story stirred your heart, like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and drop a comment below. What did the secret place reveal to you?